Canada for the New Horizons funding that has assisted St. Hilda's in the development and presentation of these forums. And our thanks to Rogers for taping and televising these forums for a much wider audience interested in issues of concern to Canadians. How should we, and how can we, address issues that are confronting aging Canadians living in our 21st century cities and neighborhoods? Can enlightened public policy and planning principles help shape our urban environments in a way that might enhance living conditions as we enter our more mature years? How should public services adapt delivery systems and communications to meet the needs of a rapidly aging society? With increasing numbers of Canadians facing retirement, what are the implications for urban infrastructure, intergenerational relations, and quality of life issues? Are current services offered by all levels of government capable of acknowledging and responding creatively to this impending demographic? How, for example, might large-scale developments like Yorkdale or Eaton Centre, Toronto General Hospital, the University of Toronto, or even Terminal 1 at Pearson Airport be designed in the future to attract and accommodate the needs of older persons? How is policing to adapt to increasing numbers of vulnerable persons in need of protection from violence or fraud? What can urban design and planning principles offer our neighborhoods to promote healthy and safe aging and generally promote and enhance quality of life for all generations sharing the same space together? Welcome to St. Hilda's third forum dealing with various issues of aging. This evening, we turn our attention to the design of age-friendly cities, safety and security. We are honored to be in the presence of such a distinguished panel represented by persons with preeminent qualifications and experience. We welcome John Tory of radio station CFRB, who has agreed to moderate our forum. Mr. Tory is a former leader of the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party and a former member of the Ontario Provincial Parliament. Joining him on the panel, we welcome Harold Becker, MD and PhD, currently Medical Director of St. Hilda's Towers, in a centre of both independent and assisted living for seniors located in the heart of Toronto. Joining Dr. Becker is William Bill Blair, Chief of the Toronto Police Service. Chief Blair commands the largest municipal police force in Canada and one of the largest in North America. With considerable experience in urban planning and development, we welcome noted and distinguished Canadian architect Eb Zeidler, a member of both the Order of Canada and the Order of Ontario. His projects span the world and have influenced architects and urban planners alike for many, many years. And with considerable experience in urban planning within this great city, we are fortunate indeed to welcome to forum number 3, Mr. Gary Wright, who is the current Chief Planner and Executive Director of the City of Toronto Planning Department, one of the major and most influential municipal planning departments in North America. I'm Canon Derwin Shea, Rector and Chairman of St. Hilda's, and on behalf of the wardens and our Board of Directors and residents of this great facility dedicated to the nurturing and care of seniors, will you join with me in extending a very warm welcome to our distinguished panel. And now, Mr. Tory, may I turn the forum over to your very capable leadership.
If I can ask the panel perhaps to, I'd like to maybe get an overall assessment first, and we'll start at this end and work our way down. But I'd just like to ask you before we get into some specifics. I have a sense when it comes to whether it's our finances, whether it's our healthcare system, whether it's our planning, whether it's our all kinds of different things, that we are not moving as quickly and as aggressively as we should be if we looked at straight demographics and the rapidly increasing numbers of senior citizens we already have and are going to have in the next 10 or 15 years. And I wondered, each from your own perspective, whether you think we're paying enough attention to these issues in general, and then we'll move to discuss some specific topics. So Gary, can I ask you to answer first?
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. It's a beautiful building and a beautiful place to be in. I think the point you made about the changing demographics and how we are an aging society, and how do we respond to that? I think one of the ways we respond to it is we think about how our city is planned, how people walk on its streets, how people get accessibility to the services they need. And I think all of those things are the responsibility of government, but they're also the responsibility of the private sector, and they're the responsibility of the institutions that we work with, the hospitals, the medical centers, those kinds of things. So one of the important things we all have to do, recognize the challenge and be willing to work with each other to solve some of the problems that we face.
All right, now this is a tough question to put to you because I'll just ask maybe one follow-up to each as you give your answer. If you look at what's going on downtown, say south of, say south of Eglinton all the way down, the number of residences that we're providing for as we see a huge building boom taking place in Toronto that we allow for in our planning, that are seniors' residences, retirement homes, and that sort of thing, where we're going to need increased numbers of those kinds of facilities with the special considerations they have for seniors, is not really that many, it seems to me. There's a lot of condos being built, some office buildings and so on. How do we, in your bailiwick, make sure that there are enough places for seniors to live where they can walk to the shops, where they can take advantage of being in a city and not be in far-flung places where you have to take transit, which gets harder the older you get?
Yeah, it does get harder to have transit, but I think actually transit is also part of the solution, because as you get older, you may not want to drive everywhere. So I think transit has to be part of the solution, and part of the solution is looking at our avenues like Eglinton Avenue. It won't be that far in the future when we're going to have an LRT, a high-capacity transit system underground along Eglinton. That will, I think, be a good thing, not just for this area, but for different parts of the city, because people will have accessibility to quite a good, safe system in terms of getting across the city. That's part of the answer. I think you made a point about who's living downtown, and you're right. There are a lot of younger people, a lot of couples that live downtown. But I also had the opportunity to work in Etobicoke for about 5 years, and I was involved in a number of senior-type accommodations in Etobicoke. And one of the things that I recognized was that people become very attached to their neighborhoods, and they like to live and grow up in their neighborhoods. They want to retire in their neighborhoods as well. And I think it's important that we make accommodation for that, and I was fortunate to be involved in a few of those developments. So it's not just about whether people want to retire or live downtown. It's about, do they want to retire in the neighborhood they grew up in?
I'm sure we'll come back to this because I think there are considerations Mr. Zyder will probably address and others that relate to built form and what we're building and what we're not building. But if I can move along to Dr. Becker and ask you the same question. In light of the demographics, the realities we know are upon us in terms of the aging population and so on, are we, from a medical, healthcare standpoint, moving quickly enough to adapt to what will become, if it hasn't already, the new reality?
You of all people, John, know that it's a complete disaster out there in healthcare.
Well, I didn't want to say that. I thought you'd say it.
I'll say it for you.
I just talked for 3 hours, so now it's your turn.
Yeah, what they call the demographic pyramid. This is a graphical presentation of how the baby boomers have moved through the aging each decade, and how while they were the hippies in the 70s and 60s and 70s, and they became the mainstream in the 70s and 80s, they're now getting into the senior citizen group. And in terms of health care, they are going to be consuming an awful lot of health care at a very high expense. And governments all the way through have paid virtually no attention to this. They should have been collecting tax money back 10 years ago when, interestingly, the baby boomers were at their peak of their income in their 50s. And the governments should have been banking that taxation in preparation for the next decade, where that was going to be spent on health care of the same people. And they have not done so. So we're facing a very grim future in terms of health care, and I don't know what's coming. I mean, both provincial parties are planning to spend $6 billion in the next 4 years to maintain some level of health care, but it's just postponing the whole business. The encouraging thing is that the federal government at least has acknowledged the 5 areas that they want to reduce wait times, and these are areas that actually affect seniors more than anybody. So there's care, there's cancer, there's orthopedic hip and knee. Note, there's not orthopedic shoulder and wrist, which is what you'd see in athletes and younger people, but you see hip and knees that tend to go out in people of the age of the population here. So there is encouragement there that at least somebody's paying some attention. I'm sure they know about somebody knows the power of the senior voters out there, and also the percentage of voters, the senior voters who actually go out and vote. So that may be a very strong potential force that we can muster to try to get governments to do the right thing.
This, of course, is a very big subject, obviously, the whole issue of seniors and healthcare. But if you looked at one aspect that I became a bit familiar with, and there's nothing like going out with some of the people on the front lines, whether it's police officers, and I went out in an ambulance for a day when I was a politician to see what they did. And what you found was a lot of the calls they made were on seniors who would have, say, constant, fairly recurring blood pressure problems, and the only response they had available was to call an ambulance. The ambulance would come at huge expense to the system, often feel they had to take the senior to the hospital to be checked. They would be in the hospital waiting in the emergency room for a long time. The ambulance was tied up there. Is there any chance that we'd be looking, among other ideas, at going back to the future and saying maybe we should be having doctors making house calls again and have specific doctors who are assigned to go to elderly people who are not in a position to get to the doctor's office on their own? Instead of having an ambulance, we'd have a doctor go and see if there's a bit of a blood pressure issue, check out the medication, and if there's need for an ambulance, then call one. Do you think ideas like that, is anybody talking about that sort of thing?
Is that a new idea for you? Because that's brilliant. That's exactly what's happening right now. There's a big thrust out there for physicians to be going to make house calls. One of the problems has been that a doctor doesn't make a lot of money to make a house call compared to sitting in the office and seeing 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 patients during that same time frame that are sitting in the waiting room for 2 hours. So there's not a big incentive to go to the homes of seniors. Those doctors who do it have a different altruistic view of things, and they do it out of not the goodness of their heart. They're getting well paid, but it's not an efficient use of the healthcare system as it is now. We need nurse practitioners. We need people trained, physician assistants who can go and do that. Blood pressure is an easy, straightforward thing, and a lot of what goes on in the home visits are is really a reassurance and keeping in touch with. Bringing health care to the senior rather than the senior to the health care.
Okay, Chief Blair, a lot of people might think, well, seniors are the most peaceful and peaceable of the citizens you have to serve and protect, and therefore why would we worry about how aging would impact on police work, except to say that it'll get better because you'll have more people who are seniors and fewer trouble causers. But having said that, I guess there's a flip side to this, which is that some seniors get a little bit more vulnerable, especially if they have some health issues, and that there are specific things we're probably going to have to focus on to a greater extent in your work, whether it be fraud or whether it be elder abuse. And perhaps you could talk a little bit about the challenges facing the police service in terms of serving a population that will be aging as time goes on.
Yeah, thank you, John. And by the way, thank you to St. Hilda's and Reverend Canon Shea for giving us an opportunity to come. I'm quite honored to have the opportunity to come and speak to you tonight. John, you're absolutely correct. What we are seeing is a rapidly aging demographic within our population, which is significantly increasing the number of seniors in our city and right across Canada. And there's good news in that, because generally those seniors are pretty well behaved. And so what we will see as a greater proportion of our population ages, that there will be reductions in overall crime rates and levels of violence in our community, and that's a very positive thing. But at the same time, that population is a vulnerable population, and they're vulnerable to certain types of victimization. So often that victimization is a result of the social isolation of many of our seniors. The fact that they don't have access to services or are in constant communication with their neighbors because of health concerns and other aspects of aging that makes them a special needs population, a population which is more vulnerable to victimization. That victimization can take many forms. It can take the form of victimization of physical abuse or even financial abuse within a family setting. And the opportunity for the authorities, both the police and the criminal justice system, to intervene appropriately in our society in such abuse is somewhat limited because of the isolation that so many of our seniors experience. And so we see aspects of both their physical abuse and financial abuse, either from family members or from unscrupulous house repair individuals or others who would defraud seniors through telemarketing and through various schemes. that is a great concern to us, and one of the great challenges, of course, is reaching that vulnerable population and providing them with the protection that they deserve, the opportunity to live in dignity and respect and in safety, free from that victimization. And one other thing I'd really like to mention, because it's a statistic that is of great concern to me. Each year, we lose a number of our citizens to pedestrian traffic fatalities. And these are all preventable crimes and a great tragedy for everyone involved. And perhaps one of the most disturbing things about those senseless tragedies is that more than 50% of the people who die in pedestrian fatalities in Toronto are seniors. And there are a number of reasons for that. And there are things that I think we can do as a society, certainly the things that the police are trying to do, but things that we can all do in public education, not only for our drivers, but also for the seniors, in how we design our roads, that we can prevent so many of those senseless tragedies. And, you know, people who have given so much to our society and have so much to contribute, we should not allow them to be so vulnerable to these risks that living in a large urban center can bring. And, you know, when I go into communities and I speak to seniors, so often they talk about those traffic concerns, and it's a sad commentary, I think, on us as a society that that's such a significant safety concern to people that we should protect.
We'll drill down on each of those as we have the time over the panel, but I want to drill down on one of the first ones you mentioned first, namely elder abuse. And I know over the years there have been developed a lot of protocols, a lot of procedures, even laws that have been changed in the area of domestic abuse, which will distinguish from elder abuse. Sometimes it could be one and the same, but have you got the tools you need? Do you have the training programs that we will increasingly need on the part of your men and women to be equipped to deal with instances of elder abuse, which is different than, say, a domestic abuse? Both are abuse, but they involve different groups of people in different situations. Do you feel you have the tools and the resources to take account of what will be coming in terms of just an increase, unfortunately, in this kind of thing as we have more seniors?
Let me qualify that. I think we can do better. I think we have to do better. And I believe the laws that we have available to us are adequate, but the response may not be. One of the things we did with domestic violence a number of years ago is take away the responsibility from the victim's, usually a spouse, usually a woman, to make all of the decisions with respect to how that matter would be dealt with. And one of the things that the criminal justice system and the police have done in those circumstances is where there is evidence of a physical assault, where there's evidence of the abuse, we don't require the victim to complain or to indicate they are a victim. We'll lay the charge and give the authorities the opportunity to make an appropriate intervention, to make that situation safer. And I can tell you it has saved lives. It makes a difference. It makes it safer for women and for families and for children who are living in abusive and violent relationships to obtain help and to be protected. That's our responsibility. I think the same laws can be applied in the same way in incidents of other types of family violence and need to be applied in other types of family violence. But I can also tell you that the criminal justice system is perhaps a little lagging in this regard. We need to turn our attention more effectively. We need to not only lay charges where it's appropriate to make sure that there are good, strong social system supports, there are advocacy groups and support agencies existing in the community. I can tell you that many of those things exist today in Toronto for other victims of family violence, for children and for women who are being abused. But for elder abuse, we have a long way to go. And I think it's very important to have these type of discussions, to recognize that this is an increasing problem in our society and to acknowledge that we can do better. We need to do better. And that requires an investment, and it requires a commitment from all of us who serve our communities to find better solutions to protect people and to break that cycle of violence that so often comes from that social isolation, to open the doors to shed light on that problem and to make sure that people know that there is help available to them and how they can protect themselves.
All right, thank you, Chief. Eb Zeidler, as was mentioned, is not just an architect, but he's one of our most distinguished architects in the country. I think I'm right, Ontario Place. Am I right, the Eaton Centre as well? Both yours? Certainly Ontario Place for sure. Am I right on both of those?
Well, I have to admit something. As one of the 15% of the population that are over 85, I haven't understood a word you have said.
Okay. Well, does that mean I have to talk louder or slower or both? Because I speak quickly.
Earphones and all kinds of things I have. And I don't know what it is, but that's a problem that separates people from each other. And I think we are at the moment in a position where we were maybe 20 years ago when we realized, or 30 years ago, that the car wasn't the solution to our life as we thought it was, and that we could do everything we wanted to do with a car. Suddenly we realized that it really kind of was against what we had to do, and that we had to much more see how we could commune without the car. And this is a problem we are sitting in now to solve. We haven't solved it yet, but we have spread out, and we can't find each other together. And that same happened to the families, that they spread out, and now when you're old and you need support, you need somebody who is with you, who can guide you and can do something. He isn't there. And that is one of the problems we have to solve. How do we, it is not just a matter that you take old people and put them in a home and say that's all solved for you. It is kind of, if you look back at the old family in the farm where the whole generations lived together, the baby, the mother, the father, the grandmother, and even the great-grandmother in one house, that lived together and helped each other and supported each other. And this is what's needed to kind of get this feeling together. How we do it, we don't know. We can't just do it the way it has been done, because jobs kind of tear families apart. But we have to find a way in which we can do that again, so that as a person, you don't, I'm, for example, couldn't live without my wife, because she has to help me and drag me around, because I can't walk and drive anymore. And so if I hadn't a wife, I wouldn't know what to do. And so that's the problem we're facing. How do we knit the families together again, and how do we knit our life together again? And it's not just a matter of making safe roads and better corridors and elevators. It is this system that we have to solve.
Let me ask you, and can you hear me a little better if I come a little bit closer? Is that a little better?
I'm slowly understanding you.
Okay. I wanted to ask you this, because I think it ties together, and maybe I'll ask Gary to comment on it after you. One of the things that would help, I suppose, beyond an attitude change, because I think a lot of our friends in the Asian community, for example, have it as much more a part of their culture that they will look after the grandmothers and the fathers and do it in their own home. But I think a lot of the homes that we built many years ago don't properly accommodate having a senior come to live, for example, and I'm not sure we don't make it hard to have like what we would call a granny flat or a grandpa flat in the house. Is that partly what might help bring these families back together, is to have accommodation available in the home that will take account of the age, people being older and needing certain things?
Well, I think you realize that as you get older. I start to realize it, that you can't do things that you could do, and that you can't move the way you could move, and that you need somebody to help you. And this somebody can be somebody help an organization or something like that, but it can be your family. But it is more pleasant if it's your family that can help you. And if your son can do something for you, or your daughter, this is very, very helpful. And how do we get that? It is difficult in our society today when your son has a job there and your daughter has a job there, and you had a job here and are now alone. And how can they come back? This is a problem.
Could I ask you about this, Gary, because I think nowadays I've heard enough and know enough about this to know that if you in some neighborhoods suggested that you were going to make it much easier even to build a small flat, say in somebody's backyard, at ground level, even attached to the house, so that a senior wouldn't have to climb stairs and they could live with their son or daughter, as Mr. Zeidler was suggesting, that you'd get quite a bit of pushback in some of those neighborhoods about that kind of idea. Are we being more flexible about that going forward to try and encourage, actually, people to take more responsibility for their parents and for their parents to have the option of living with their kids, but living in a way that's a little bit independent and takes account of their physical inability to, say, climb stairs and be either in a basement flat or an upstairs flat, but rather to be on something you built at ground level? Are we being accommodating about that?
The city actually permits what we call second suites as of right, virtually in any existing house in the city. But that needs to be done within the house, and you have to get a building permit to do it. But we allow that. That's a right of virtually any homeowner. So we do permit it in that condition. It can be a little more difficult if you want to build a separate building behind a house. You'll probably need to go to Committee of Adjustment and get a variance. That can be a little tougher. But if you want to add a second suite in your existing house, in the basement, or renovate part of your house to do that, that is absolutely permitted by our zoning bylaws.
Dr. Becker, I wonder if I could ask you whether you've seen, and I'd be virtually certain the answer would be yes, but a difference in the sort of conditions and the number of seniors who fall between the cracks, shall we say, and get into trouble, who are living on their own in quite an isolated way, say just in an ordinary apartment building, versus people who might have been fortunate enough to live with family in a home where they're taken in. I would have thought that there'd be a general sort of better off categorization of those who can live with family as opposed to those who end up living in an apartment on their own. But tell us.
Well, a lot of seniors wind up losing their spouse. They may be living in apartments. Again, I don't know the numbers of how many people live in apartments versus homes in Toronto. But you lose the spouse, you tend to stay in the same apartment if you're able to. And then you slowly age and deteriorate, so the default becomes a little old lady in an apartment living where she probably shouldn't be living by herself. And yes, our society in Canada doesn't seem to respond well to family looking after those people. In my house, as I grew up, my grandmother lived with us. It wasn't a burden. I mean, it was normal to have grandma there. But we lived in houses with one bathroom, and the house was a tiny little house, and it had an unfinished basement, and that was normal.
And the bathroom was almost always upstairs, too.
Yeah, that's an additional problem now. These are multi-house, everything houses. What I found interesting were a lot of the new condos that are opening in Toronto are geared to homeowners who sell their house for whatever price, and whatever neighborhood these condos are being built in tend to have the price structure of the houses in the area that sell for that value. So that's an interesting little vignette that's happening. I don't know if it's wrong or right that our society doesn't look after their seniors the way the families do, the way the families should. I don't know. We can look at ethnic groups, different ethnic groups, but they're bringing that from, we would have been an ethnic group 50 years ago that would have gone somewhere and they would have said, well, look at that, those Canadians, they look after their seniors at home. So it's just a changing of time.
Well, but it is a different approach, I think. I mean, I've seen how the Asian communities take this as a responsibility almost from day one, that it's going to happen, and they view it as an honor and a privilege and an obligation, meaning an obligation in the most positive sense of the word.
But I can tell you that the families that maintain the very old seniors in a state of confusion and dementia has a terrific toll on the younger generation in that home. I think it starts to cross a line for me.
But isn't it true at the same time that a lot of those families, aside from their traditions and their culture, don't have any option for financial reasons
you're right.
to have the senior anywhere else?
You're
because
right.
if you look at the cost in many cases of where these seniors could go, they just don't have the means to have them anywhere else.
You're right.
It's a problem. Chief, can I ask you about this business that Mr. Zeidler really started to talk about, and it's come up, I think, including in your own first remarks. What do you do about a senior who has decided to stay because they want to be independent? I understand that. I've seen that with my own grandmothers, and now even my mother is by herself, and she certainly wants to be independent. And at the same time, though, it means they're alone wherever it is they're living, whether it's in an apartment building. They're alone if they're in an apartment or a house. They're not alone if they're in a senior's residence. And is it more of a challenge for you in terms of dealing with the safety and security of people who are alone, meaning in an apartment just up and down the hall, and that's just where they live?
Yeah, yes, John. I was referring earlier to this issue of social isolation, and that can happen so often with seniors who are attempting to maintain their independence, and I think we have to try to support that. But at the same time, in an apartment setting or even in a home, sometimes they become isolated from their neighbors. They become isolated from those things we all depend upon for somebody to keep an eye out for the house, keep an eye out for your safety, to make sure that you're okay if the weather gets bad or if it's particularly warm. It's a problem in many urban jurisdictions where seniors become socially isolated because of their living circumstance. And if there isn't family around that will look in for you or a caring neighbor, then it can actually become a very dangerous situation, and it significantly increase the vulnerability of people living under those circumstances that if they fall, if they become ill, if they are in some need, if there isn't a regular contact with people in the community. And the neighborhoods that work well in the city of Toronto, there is good interaction between the people in those neighborhoods. People are out on their porches, they're speaking to their neighbors, they stay in contact. And unfortunately, as we move into apartment buildings, we become more isolated because you only have contact with people in elevators and lobbies. And if a senior is unable to spend time in those elevators and lobbies, they can become very, very isolated and therefore much more vulnerable to being abused or even to be neglected. And it's one of the reasons when we do have power outages, when temperatures rise and we're concerned about the safety of all of our citizens, we'll ask people, if you've got a senior living next door, go knock. If you've got a family member that you haven't seen for a while, make sure they're okay. Make sure that they've got food in the house, that they are receiving care, that if there's an issue with the heat or illness, there's someone there to check up on it. And I think it does create a responsibility on all of us if we have someone who will look for us. But in so many cases, people, there is no nearby family. They become separated from their neighbors because changes in their neighborhood, and they become very much alone.
But I think you make a good point. I mean, we rely on government a lot of times to do these things or to have a program or some people who go around and check. But we all have a next door neighbor. I mean, everybody has one. And if you're the one that's not the senior, probably there's some onus on you just to do what you said, which is just to knock on the door and check. In a condo building or in a senior's residence, there's someone who will watch, and if they don't see or hear from Mrs. Smith at all for a number of days, they will, or a number of hours sometimes, they will make inquiries. But I think in places where there is no such concierge, no such
if people live in
superintendent.
an assisted housing situation, then I think there is people there and they are safer, but many of us do not. Many of our seniors do not. And they're the best protection, the best assurance of a safe neighborhood and the safety of our seniors is good neighbors and responsible family members who will check up and make sure that people are okay. And those who are blessed with a loving spouse or caring children, then they are far safer. But not everyone has those circumstances, and as a society, we have a responsibility to step up. We often use the phrase, it takes a village to raise a child. I think a village also has a responsibility for its most senior citizens.
Absolutely. Mr. Zeidler, can I ask you this? In the commercial building world, whether it's malls or office buildings or places where you go to the doctor, are we keeping up with the reality of the changes to having more and more seniors such that those buildings are user-friendly for those people to get to their appointments, to go shopping, or are we sort of falling behind there too?
Well, yes and no, because I find that many times the organization that controls a building starts to change the system. For example, at Eaton Center, we found that we had organized that the inside was relating to the outside, so that there's a drop from Dundas Street to Queen Street of 18 feet, which you don't realize when you walk on the street. But on the inside, it was really nearly 2 levels of changes. And so we organized the inside malls in such a way that when you walked on one side in and stepped down, you got the feel, or you were made aware of the feeling that the outside stepped also. So we put trees on this level so that the one level at trees was always parallel to the outside. And now the management decided we don't need any trees, we need more people in there. So they knocked the trees down, and we need any patterns in the floors. We made the floor clean, and it is now like a big hospital that the floors on the inside and all 3 levels are the same. And this is kind of the way in which buildings don't react to people. I mean, for example, if you go in a medieval city, you will find that every 300 feet, the vision and the elements change. And here we built an 800 feet long building of the same facade. And if you're bored walking along the building, well, that's your problem. And so all these things have to be taken into account, and particularly if you're old, you haven't the stamina to walk 800 feet without any mental interruption of something. So all these things add together. It isn't that you need a new world for the old people. You just need the old world properly presented that we have to do.
Well, on that note, maybe, Gary, I could go back down to you. And the chief made mention earlier of issues that pedestrians would face. And you look at some of the intersections, you know, not the ordinary ones that are kind of downtown where things are a bit narrower, but you look at the intersections that are the very wide ones in the suburbs where there will often be an apartment with a lot of seniors in it, and then a light, and those seniors want to be outside having a walk or going shopping or going to the bus. And even the street lights, the signals are not set up in such a way to take account of the fact that those people are going to take a little bit longer to cross the street. Are we starting to make changes in the old world? Because you're not going to change the streets around, they are what they are. But are we starting to make changes in the old world to take account of the people who now live there who are older and are going to take longer? Are we even adjusting the traffic lights sometimes, as much as you may say, well, that's going to mess up the traffic, but you know, to take account of these kinds of things, such as just crossing the street?
Yeah, I used to think that I would know when I was old when I could not get across University Avenue on one green light. And I'm almost there. And you make a very good point, which is, and Eb said it as well, we designed all of those, not the old city, but what we used to call the suburbs. They were all designed around the car. Walking was completely secondary. And I grew up in Scarborough in one of those suburbs. My mother still lives there. Fortunately, she still drives, and Chief, she still has her license. But we can do things, some things, I think, better to help people who need to walk and want to walk in those conditions. And one of the things that I've noticed recently is the innovation of the timing that shows you how much time you have left to cross the street. I think those visual clues are very helpful to everybody, and not just to seniors, they're helpful to younger people as well. I think how we design the sidewalks so that they are a safe sidewalk to be on. I'm actually quite disturbed by the chief's comment about the incidence of seniors involved in pedestrian accidents. I did not know that. And I think that's a serious and significant issue that the police and the city can find ways to work together on. Because those are, if you can't walk safely in your neighborhood, that is a real problem.
You know, it's so interesting you should say that, because one of the questions I thought of after a couple of the answers a few minutes ago was, you sometimes have the sense, like a lot of areas of government and public service, that the planning department, the medical and healthcare profession, the policing service, and people who are designing and operating big buildings, malls and so on, actually don't really have a place where they ever sit down and would talk, for example, as we're doing now, about the overall ways in which we can make life easier for a growing number of senior citizens. I would ask you, Dr. Becker, I mean, to your knowledge, is there, aside from panels like this, is there any place where these discussions are going on to address what is clearly one of the biggest realities that's coming down the road at us, no matter what we say, it's happening? And are there places where these discussions are happening with policymakers saying we're going to change the old world to take account of the new world?
No, not at all. Not to my knowledge. I get all sorts of literature, medical literature coming in, and I don't see any of that.
Because again, I mean, the very fact that Gary's got a lot on his plate, and so does the chief, but the fact he would hear about that you know, here, I mean, I think it's good that he did, but, you know, there's a lot of decisions being made about streets and lights and things, not all in his domain. But Chief, are there places your officers and senior people can go to talk about seniors' issues with policymakers, or is it not really happening yet?
We have some conversation with policymakers. We have to do better. You know, when we see on an unacceptable level, and every single traffic injury and fatality is unacceptable. When you see a lot of seniors are being injured, our response is usually twofold. We go out and try to educate seniors to be more careful when they're crossing the road and educate drivers through enforcement. But it's clearly not enough. And what we're seeing, and I think this is going to become a bigger problem, it is primarily a suburban problem. It's not something that really happens downtown. It happens in suburban areas. It also happens because as seniors get older, they lose their licenses, they have to become pedestrians. They're forced into that, and many of the places in which they live are not particularly pedestrian friendly. It may be a long distance, for example, from their apartment building to the nearest crosswalk, and they're in a hurry, and they don't move as quickly. And drivers, I think, remain quite aggressive or inattentive. And all of those things can contribute to an unacceptable level of violence against our seniors out on the street. You know, as Gary's talking about planning, clearly planning and road design and our roads department have a very significant role to play in this. Sometimes this happens in public service. We all look at our own part of the business. We look at the things that we can do something about, and we work really hard at it. And when we all get together, we find the solution so often is in the partner's place. And once the partner has the information he needs, we can make a difference. And so I think that'll help.
There's quite a bit of discussion today, even in the news, about how many police officers you have at your disposal and the budgets and so on. Is it the case right now, and I don't mean to be critical of the seniors for this, but that a lot of the time of your officers that might be, spent chasing down criminals and so on actually ends up in calls that are meant to help frail people that probably don't require a police officer but end up with one, and that if you were able to have some other people that were going to do this, that provide home care and look in on, that you would end up having a better time, an easier time to some extent policing, because they're going to be doing real police work, if I can call it that, as opposed to...
One of the things about policing is that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, we'll come. If you call, we'll come. And we, you know, people think that we're in the law enforcement business and we go out and catch bad guys, and we do, and that's an important part of what we do. But it's only a small percentage of what we do, and mostly we respond to people's calls for help, and we come and answer their concerns, and we deal with problems and questions that people have. It's a big part of our job, is this order maintenance and dealing with things that we call quality of life. And I can give you an example, John, of how we can find a better way sometimes to use our resources. One of the problems that we have in our city is people who are suffering from mental illness. And the police used to go, and we would just arrive, and it was sometimes very difficult. Police are not particularly well trained to deal with people who are suffering from mental illness, and as well, we have a limited number of tools available to us. We're in the law enforcement business, and a person suffering from mental illness shouldn't be arrested, but it's one of the few tools that we had available to us. And so we went to the medical community, and actually I went to the medical community, and I went to the hospitals, and I said, I want you to put a mental health professional in a police car with one of my guys. And we'll go out there, and we call them medical crisis intervention teams. And if there's a person suffering from a mental health crisis, then instead of just sending the police with our limited ability to respond, we send both a police officer to make it safe and a medical professional to ensure that the right outcome is achieved for that individual. It saved us an enormous amount of time, an enormous amount of money. It's a smart way to respond. And the most important thing is achieving good outcomes from people suffering from mental illness. And I think there's a lesson in that. I think there's a lesson in all of the different, very complex issues that we respond to as a society, to people who are elderly, to people who are in violent situations, to people who need help, that we should partner up, work together, and find the smartest way to respond, just not the quickest way to respond.
See, that's why these meetings are so important. I had a listener call the other day when we were discussing this and say to me, as part of your challenge in staffing your police cars, that instead of sending 2 police officers out, as we often do on some shifts under the law, that you should send a police officer and a social worker. They were citing the same kind of example, and it turns out you're way ahead of us and you're already doing it. And because it makes sense that that's sometimes the help you need, and it also
John, if someone falls down on the street, senior or of any age, the fire department will come, the ambulance will come, and the police will come. It costs about $3,000 each time we do that. Any one of the 3 of us could handle the call, but all 3 of us go. It's not the most efficient way to do business.
Can I ask you, Doctor, just with respect to this we identified earlier of trying to fill in. You talked about the fact that some doctors are out doing some things for people in their homes, but there's an awful lot of other seniors who I don't think are getting easy access to the care they need. They end up, back to the example I gave earlier, in the emergency room, the most expensive place, the least service-friendly place. I mean, they try their best, but the place is crowded. What can we do about that? What's the one measure you could take if you had a magic wand in the healthcare system to improve the level of access to care for seniors?
I'm not sure the exact answer to your question, but I was making some notes while the chief was talking. We do a very good job alerting drivers to children. Children are out on holidays, and I think that's really worked on reducing speeding in school zones, et cetera, et cetera. I never hear anything about seniors, and perhaps a blitz on that kind of a thing, or a social awareness that there are seniors out there that are walking slowly. A few years ago, Gary was talking about him crossing university. Some years ago, my kid was hitting balls out to me in the field, and I was jumping for them and always missing them. And I was missing them by about this much. And I realized that I just wasn't as springy as I used to be, and I'm not even getting that old. So obviously we do slow down. We expect we can run faster or walk more quickly. We expect we can enter the intersection and get across with 7 seconds to go, et cetera. And I think that that is a fantastic situation with the numbers, whoever decided to do that, kudos to them. Another comment, there's 50% of 80 some odd year old people have significant dementia. If you are fortunate or unfortunate enough to live to 85, you'll have more likely than not some degree of
50%.
Dementia. Yeah, 50%. Wow. And I would submit that a number of the accidents that are happening and the seniors getting hit by vehicles are probably cognitively impaired to some degree. Now, maybe we should be increasing that awareness. We should be making it very easy for seniors to have some kind of GPS signal on them. We don't lose many seniors, but it'd be nice to keep track of individuals if they wanted to be kept track of, and longer. Certainly, the city should look at longer lights. That's an obvious thing. Longer green lights and intersections. Although I don't know that would ultimately help, because if you don't start on the beginning of the green, and if you have some cognitive impairment, it's a wash.
Chief, the same when we talk about the percentage of people, and it's quite a stunning number, who might have some degree of dementia or some cognitive impairment, it is probably going to make them perhaps less able to deal with the fraudsters that are out there, and you're stunned when you see these stories on television about people masquerading as somebody's grandson and calling looking for money and so forth. How do you, I mean, because obviously you want to stop these things before they start. Oftentimes when you're called in, it's too late, the money's gone. How do we combat that? How do we educate people? How do we help people to cope with those kinds of phone calls that will come when maybe they're not as able to deal with them as they might have been 10 years earlier?
And we've undertaken a number of, I think, important public education initiatives. I have in my service an elder abuse coordinator who's responsible for gathering information and making sure that we get it out to various senior organizations. We produce a calendar every year along with one of our important corporate partners, for example, where we provide information to seniors, and we do it through a number of different forums and agencies to provide them with information on how to protect themselves, how to recognize those who would be there to defraud them. But it is very difficult, and as Harold has indicated, there are a number of people who are suffering some level of cognitive disability, memory problems or whatever, and again, through that isolation, they're very easily victimized. And it remains a huge challenge for us. We need to do a number of things. I think public education is really important. We also have to enlist the help of those who are here to support seniors in the churches, in those assisted living situations or nursing homes that they exist. Those who provide services to seniors have to develop a greater awareness so that they recognize the signs of victimization. So many times what we find is the people that prey upon seniors, they rely on the trust and that isolation. Well, they'll phone and they'll pretend to be a friend or a family member, and they'll just engage people in conversation. And when people have lived in isolation, they're very pleased to have someone who will come and talk to them. And yet, unfortunately, there are some that would prey upon the most vulnerable people in our society, including seniors, and we need to be able to recognize that. And the other part of that, I think the police have to do a better job of holding those people to account when we can catch them, and the courts have to do a good job of making sure that the penalties that they receive upon conviction reflect the condemnation and abhorrence that society should feel for these types of crimes. And we don't take fraud very seriously. Very few people go to jail for fraud, and yet a senior who has been defrauded loses much more than their money. They lose dignity. They lose that sense of pride that comes with their independence, and it increases their sense of vulnerability, and it has a huge impact on the quality of their life. So when they are robbed, they lose a lot more than just some of their money. And the money is important, but so much more is taken from them, and our response to that should reflect the seriousness of that victimization.